like to welcome our NextUp speaker, Stacey Gordon. She's the Senior Account Manager at Export Development Canada. So please give us a warm welcome for Stacey. Okay. So Stacey, maybe you could share a little bit about your background. You're an Albertan, I think. Lloydminster could be one or the other, but maybe talk about a little bit about your background and where you decided to go for education and what you decided to take and how you've kind of got to where you are today.
Sure. So when I was in Lloydminster, I stayed on the Alberta side. So I've been an Albertan my entire life, with the exception of a 6-month stint in Mexico City. So grew up in the Edmonton area. My family moved us to Lloydminster for high school. Was very excited to come back to Edmonton for post-secondary. I did do a year at Lakeland College. It was 3 minutes from my parents' house, so that was pretty convenient. For my second year, I moved and actually came here to MacEwan. So at the time, it was college. And then transferred over to University of Lethbridge to take an international management degree. So within that degree, I did, again, my last semester in Mexico City. It was great, great experience. I then came back from Mexico City into Calgary, and just shortly after I moved to Calgary, excuse me, because I had worked while I was in my undergrad, I was allowed to take my MBA, so I didn't have to wait the typical 3 years, which I don't even know if it's relevant anymore, but they took my work experience from my undergrad as my 3 years, and I was able to start my MBA in Calgary. At the time, University of Phoenix out of the States had a campus in Calgary, so I worked full-time, did my MBA full-time, got married, and just shortly before I was done my MBA, I had opportunity to move back to Edmonton. And I started with EDC just very shortly after I moved back to Edmonton. So.
Okay. You talked about your stint in Mexico. So what was that like?
Overall, it was great. I learned a lot about life, about the world. So part of the requirement for an international management degree at U of L was to go on an exchange. And that was really one of the things that attracted me originally to the international management program was when I was in high school, even in junior high, people would come over from other countries and they would study, and I always really wanted to do that. I always really wanted to go somewhere else. So I went to Mexico City. Actually, I applied to go to Chile, and there was too many of us that applied, so a few of us kind of got kicked back. And one of the Mexican people at U of L who I had befriended said, you can go to a place like Guadalajara, or you could go to a place like Europe, but if you want like culture and if you want the full experience, you've got to go to Mexico City. So off I went by myself, 23-year-old female, flew into Mexico City, had a stranger pick me up and drop me off at a stranger's house where I was going to live for 6 months and go to school. So it was very difficult at first. I'm not going to lie, I won't sugarcoat it. I got extremely sick, spent 2 weeks in bed. I booked a flight to come home at one point because I thought, I just can't handle this. And eventually I decided to stay out the 6 months and went to school there. Learned a lot about just the culture and the people and how different it was. And that's what I can say about Mexico.
So what type of advice, if any of our students here are thinking about, going and doing that type of an exchange program, what advice would you give them in terms of getting ready for maybe some of the aspects of culture shock, of preparing yourself?
I would say, first of all, do it. So, I would hope that everyone in this room is at some point looking to go outside of their comfort zone and either work or study. It doesn't have to be a big thing. You can do things like I did a full semester, but there's 2 and 3 week study programs, there's work exchanges, all that sort of thing. I would recommend that everybody in this room take a look at that at some point and take a look at getting out of their comfort zone. It'll really shape who you are and what you want to do going forward. I went by myself, and I was the only one that wanted to go to Mexico City. Looking back, it would have been nice probably to have a group of people go. And I remember one of my friends there. I was lucky enough that University of Lethbridge took students from Mexico and sent students to Mexico. So the semester before I left, I got really involved in the international exchange program, met a bunch of Mexicans who I then went to school with the next semester. So they were a big help, and they really helped me kind of adapt. But I would say that do your research. I had the opportunity to go to Europe, and Europe is so much like Canada that I was really looking for something different, and I would advise that as well. But if you can find a little bit of comfort, if you can find some familiarity, and maybe go with a group of people or go with someone else that's just going to help you at the end of the day, I would advise that.
So what were some of the other things that you did maybe in your undergrad that or some of the things that you may have done, or some of the opportunities that you could have done and missed that you're kind of looking back on, and as an undergraduate audience, maybe some of the things that you'd recommend to do?
You know what, I look back on when I was an undergrad student, and I wish that I would have had the confidence in myself that I have now back then. And the reason I say that is because I've done a postgraduate degree. I'm looking at doing further education that I didn't have the confidence to do when I came out of my undergrad. So a CPA is what I'm looking at doing now. Mm-hmm. And when I came out of my business degree, I thought, I can't do that. It's just going to be too hard. Now I know I can do it, but my life has changed, and I have a family, and I have other things. So, I would say that, pick a direction, find something that you're really passionate about, and have the confidence to go and do it. Because now's the time when, you're getting through your first round of education, I would say. A lot of you are very young, and, you have a lot of life to lead in front of you, and the more you can invest early on, the better you'll be in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And the less you're risking too, I guess, in terms of, trying out different things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So you're currently working with Export Development Canada. So maybe just spend a little bit of time talking about what the organization does, and sure. Particularly in with all of the volatility we're seeing in markets and issues with growth and around the world. It's a scary time to be a Canadian company that's doing business internationally. Yeah. So maybe share a little bit about that.
It's, to your point, it is a scary time for Canadian businesses, but I would say that it's actually a scarier time for a Canadian business who's not doing business internationally than it is for businesses who've got kind of both markets. Mm-hmm. So before I get into that, so Export Development Canada, we're a Crown corporation. I feel very lucky, and I get to straddle the line at EDC between being a banker and working on, financing transactions and kind of a private banking type mentality. But typically in a bank, you're very shareholder driven, and so the shareholder is really after one thing, and that's making money, and that's it, just making money. And so a lot of the decisions that you make are revolving around that bottom line. Mm-hmm. At EDC, because we're a Crown corporation and our shareholder is the Government of Canada, we get to play this quasi-government role where our shareholders' mandate is a lot different. Of course, it's about the bottom line. We're profitable. We pay money to the government. We don't take it from taxes. We actually pay it. Mm-hmm. But we have this mandate, which is to support Canadian companies and to support growth. So I feel very lucky because I have this really cool job whereby I get to have this moral code of ethics, and I get to work and help Canadian companies grow. Mm-hmm. But I also get to do financing transactions, and I get to work with companies who want to do business internationally, and I get really involved in what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pretty lucky to have both those aspects.
Okay. You mentioned the word ethics, and that's a significant portion of this course. We have kind of the three areas: sustainability, ethics, and responsible management and stakeholder engagement. So what are some of the things that you've seen in terms of what you do that has maybe some ethical aspects to your job?
Well, actually, it's a great topic. Ethics and corporate social responsibility and moral responsibility, are something that we've seen play out in the global economy more seriously, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen a lot of companies be made examples of, unethical practices around the world, and, mm-hmm. And they're splashed all over. Whereas before, previous to, I would say, 2005, a lot of that stuff just didn't get talked about. Mm-hmm. Working for the federal government, and I shouldn't say I work for the federal government, they're our shareholder, I work for the organization, but having the Canadian federal government as our shareholder gives us a zero tolerance for any kind of unethical practices. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm talking very high level, I'm talking human rights, I'm talking, bribery and corruption, mm-hmm. Not just from a moral code sense. So we kind of get to act as I would say, not the pioneers, but the threshold for how companies should act. So I'll be talking to a client and they'll say, well, if I have to do this deal, it's all about lining the pockets of my agent. No, it's not about lining the pockets of your agent. And I don't want to hear that kind of stuff. And, those are the types of things that, really get companies into a bind. So when we at EDC, when we talk about ethics and corporate social responsibility, we have a zero tolerance. And we've worked with companies and we've seen companies be very successful and not have to engage in practices that we view as even just tipping the moral code or pushing the envelope, right? So we're in a world now where as you get into jobs and especially into trade and you're asked to do certain things and someone says, well, it's the way we do business here. It is now okay. It is now expected that you will say no, right? Because at the end of the day, when you work for a company as a shareholder that's about making money, as soon as you start engaging in some of that stuff, you put the entire company at risk. And those are the things that are being talked about in boardrooms. And they weren't 10 years ago. So.
And there's often, even though it might seem like a small amount today, there's that slippery slope where you don't know what you're getting into. Once you've started to compromise your ethics and your values, the next time it might be, if it's just maybe $100 here, it might be $1,000 the next time, and that becomes a major issue that you lose your credibility.
Exactly, and I think we look at technology and there's this idea of Big Brother watching, and some of the things that we've seen happen, are kind of out of this world, right? Everybody's watching all the time. There's things that happen. It's gone past the days where it's kind of an old boys club that says, okay, don't worry about that. We'll just make it go away. If you put your company at risk by doing something, you're probably going to get caught. And the U.S. has way stricter laws than Canada does, but we are coming up to those standards. And we've seen. I mean, we had a few years ago Siemens in Germany. They were in a huge scandal. Right now, if anyone's familiar with Petrobras in Brazil.
In Brazil, with their president.
And people are getting fired, and it's just see you later. No matter what happened over here and what was discussed in in closed doors, as soon as it's become public, then away we go. I have a company that I worked with a lot a few years ago here in Edmonton that used to do a lot of business in Algeria, and their government-owned oil and gas company was caught with doing some unethical practices around bidding and that sort of thing. And so, we did extensive work with the company to say, were you guys involved in this? Did you know about this? How did this actually work? And they said, no, we're fine. And Sonatrach had to go to a public bidding system. So every bid they all of a sudden, every bid they had to go to a public bidding, and they could no longer give contracts kind of behind closed doors. And my company went out of business because they didn't get any contracts. And so, you look back on that and you say, you were probably involved in that, and you lost at the end because you lost your entire business from that. So it will come back.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the companies in Canada. The big one that hit the headlines probably a couple of years ago was SNC-Lavalin.
Yeah.
And that one, I think, caused the government to actually talk about how it was giving contracts domestically, that it wouldn't engage a company like SNC that had been, complicit in human rights or having bribery and things like that in other countries. So they've changed their own procurement policies to back up the law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And one thing a lot of people don't realize, especially when you're looking at it from like an SNC-Lavalin, I don't have all the details around that. Of course, I remember it all going through, but for those of you who are going to go out and be entrepreneurs and work, whether it's in Canada or in the U.S. or internationally, when you get engaged in something like that, or when those accusations fly around, it affects every part of your business. It affects your bank's willingness to work with you, and get money to keep doing your business. It affects your supplier's ability to work with you. It affects kind of every aspect of your business because no one else wants to put themselves at risk. And so again, it's just something that's really coming to the forefront. Technology is helping it, government intervention, that sort of thing. So we are kind of going into a new era when it comes to corporate social responsibility.
Yeah. So when you think back about when you started at EDC and what you're doing now, what's your favorite things that you do during the day, and how does your day typically transpire? Do you have a typical day, or what types of things do you do? What energizes you when you're working?
Yeah, I have a few kind of typical days. You have in the office days where you're going through, for me, typically putting deals together, looking at financial information. I have days where, and I try to structure my days so they're kind of the same in clumps. I have days where I'm out talking to businesses in Edmonton, companies who are either exporting already or want to export. When we get into discussions like, okay, what is your strategic plan? Where do you want to go? What product or service do you offer that is competitive in the global market, and how can we help you get there? So those are some of the discussions that we have. What kind of money do you need to get there? I work a lot with the financial institutions in Edmonton and Calgary as well, and so a typical day might be doing a few what we call bank presentations or coffees. Just, hey, what's on your desk? What's impeding you from lending money on an export basis, which is really the essence of what EDC does, is provide money to companies who are doing a lot of trade, because as soon as you get assets outside of the country, a Canadian financial institution gets really nervous and doesn't like to use those assets to secure their financing. So we step in. So I have a few different days, but really, what we're supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis is removing barriers so companies export more. And that's typically through finance.
So there's trade financing and insurance products, as well as financing of investment as well?
So one of the really cool things that I get to do, and again, this is kind of playing on that public part of my job, is we actually get to introduce Canadian companies to international companies. So at EDC, we have offices around the world, and those offices are there to actually engage in financing agreements with big companies. So a few of those big companies, BMW would be one of them that everyone is aware of. So we provide a lot of financing into BMW, and the idea there is that they take that financing and buy from Canadian companies. In oil and gas, we look at companies like Pemex, the largest government-owned oil and gas company in the world, government-owned by Mexico. We have a string of U.S. companies that we finance. And we're not the only financiers. There's other export credit agencies and other banks. But we say, here's money, here's $500 million, here's $1 billion. We want you to use this money to buy from Canadian companies. I get to go to my companies and say, what are you doing? Where do you want to do it? And can we actually make a formal introduction so you can get past those barriers and work with that client? So that's really great.
That's really great. So how did you prepare, like when you didn't take this, you didn't really, you didn't start with EDC after you graduated. So, if we're thinking about our own students and trying to get into something that's international, how did you get in? You worked in the finance side first and then went over to the international side with that international experience from Mexico, I guess, that kind of allowed you to show that you were really interested in international kind of operations and travel.
Yeah, it was a combination of the two. I look at my degree almost as just kind of an overarching general, international business. You take a lot of different things, and then you go abroad and learn some stuff. But really, what solidified my position at EDC was being in my MBA, so showing that I was interested in further education, and then my finance background as well. So, I kind of, my lecture, whenever students come up and say, hey, what do I do after school? How do I get a job? I always say, you know what, you need the education. You need the education to open doors, but you need a skill as well. And so for me, that skill was finance. When I was 17, I took a work experience class. They placed me in a bank because I thought it would be cool to go see all the money in the vault. And I started working with TD Bank, and I progressed through TD Bank from that point. Started out as a teller, worked as a personal banker. When I was in university, I was underwriting credit. And then as I got done my degree, it was really hard to transition into international business because I was already involved in banking, and that's kind of where it is. And so it's looking for the right opportunities, and jumping at them, right? And thinking, okay, I can do this. But it's also about saying, I've got the education, I know I can learn, but I also have developed this skill. So, my first jobs at the bank, I didn't get paid very much, and they were hard, and I was learning a lot. But that's what propelled me ahead of a lot of other of my student peers, is that I had the education and the work experience.
Work experience,
Yeah.
it's probably been a dream of a lot of people to go into a vault.
Yeah.
What was that experience
It's
like?
not as exciting though, right?
No,
Because
is
you kind of realize that this is great, but it's not my money, so like what does it matter? It's just paper, right?
Yeah,
So
okay.
it was a little bit of a letdown.
I have this, now I don't know if any of our students have read, but they used to have the Disney comics with Scrooge McDuck, with the vault of money that he used to kind of, bathe in and things like that. Nobody...
Money is very dirty. That is not
Dirty,
realistic.
not a realistic thing, yeah. So what would be some of the challenges that you've maybe overcome? Do you have any that you could think of that, obstacles that, you had to overcome in terms of education or some of those career limiting things, and where you had to make that real check of, do I really want this? Is there anything that really, come to mind for that?
Well, the first thing I guess was that, when I was at Lakeland College in Lloydminster, I was applying to universities, I didn't get into my first choice university. And that was pretty heartbreaking at the time. I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm a failure. I can't, how am I gonna do this? And I had people in my life saying, well, you already work at a bank. Like, why would you even need a degree? And, and when those two things are happening, it's really easy to say, yeah, like they're right? I can just work at the bank and make good money. I'm already making more than all of my friends, right? But at some point you have to make a choice of what you want your future to look like. And, every time I kind of come up to one of those stumbling blocks, I think, okay, what do I want my life to look like in a year, in 2 years? And, I look at things kind of in incrementality. The next 10 years is gonna go by, whether we like it or not, right? So I can just continue doing the same thing for 10 years and 10 years look back and say, oh, that was okay. Or I can make an incremental improvement every year and at least have something accomplished in the next 10 years, because either way I'm ending up at that 10 years. And so, when you look at making life decisions, like what am I going to do next, I always kind of take that approach. So when I didn't get, into my first choice university, I kind of took the time, I let my brain get around it, and I had to pick myself up and think of the next option and decide for myself that I was moving through, right? Had I gotten to my first choice, I would have floated through, not having to make a lot of really major decisions. I just kind of would have went. But I really forced me to have to take a look around and what was I going to do and where was I going to go. So I think that was a first kind of obstacle I had to overcome when I was young. And then since then, I think it's just been life decisions. So a lot of you are at different stages in your life. I know for me, when I went into international business, I thought, okay, I'm going to be that person that, spends my life in airports. I'm going to fly around. I'm going to do cool stuff. And, I'm going to have this like sexy travel life. And, and then I got to Mexico and it was great. But when people travel and they talk about certain things, no one talks about the lonely times, right? No one talks about when you're stuck in your apartment watching like very bad English TV because, you're not going to go outside in the middle of Mexico City at 9 o'clock at night unless someone comes to your door, right? And that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, not to make it sound really bad, but it's not all glory, and things happen. And so there's been certain things in my life, meeting my husband, having parents sick, the decision whether to have a family, which really makes you decide, okay, what is important and how am I going to take this? So there was a time in my life where I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to work in international business because I'm not going to be able to fly all over the place and do the sexy things. But what's turned out to be a really great career, I get to work in international business, I get to stay where my family is, and I get to do the things that are important to me. Yeah. So, I would say is be very open, look at all the different possibilities, don't limit yourself maybe by your own scope, because if I had done that, I definitely wouldn't be here today.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions that one of our students asked is, do you feel that, when you started university, that now where you've ended up is where you would have seen yourself? No. Okay. No. So ultimately, at the beginning of it, it's totally different. And
when I hit that plane from Mexico City, I thought there was no way I'd ever live back in Edmonton. Not a chance. So, or Canada, even at that time.
Yeah.
So, but I'm very happy to be here, and this is my home. Yeah.
Okay. So. And another question is regarding the learning curve that you've gone down. In terms of your own learning curve, maybe you could talk about what you would consider your biggest learning curve when you began to work for your current occupation or in any other job. So what were the things that, you really needed to put a lot of effort into?
I think, learning, I guess, how to be a people person and how to relate to people, kind of in a sales job where you go in and you say, I'm here to help you, and someone that looks like they could be your dad, like age-wise and stuff, kind of goes like, who are you? So for me, the biggest learning curve was being very young in the industry and having to present myself in such a way. The other biggest learning curve that I'm still kind of going through is to be okay with not knowing. So to be okay with asking questions, if I'm in front of a client or in front of my boss, not thinking, oh, I better not ask that because I should probably know it. Yeah. I'd probably be a lot farther in some of the things that I can do if I would have had the courage to ask questions early and not think, oh, I'm supposed to know this, so I'm not actually going to ask. It's probably a stupid question. And that would be really good advice for anyone in the room, right? When you're in a career, when you're in a profession, CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies often don't know how their operations operate, right? And they should ask. There's no such thing as a dumb question, and I would be a lot further along, probably just in what I can do if I would have asked some of the very obvious questions early.
And that's one of the skills that I think people have is that sense of knowing when to ask the question and being inquisitive about, without putting people on a defensive. Yeah. So that's a very good skill. And the other side is the imposter. When you get in there and somebody thinks that, or you think that you should know everything, and that if they ask a question and you don't know it, you feel like an imposter. Has that ever happened with you, or how do you get beyond that?
I think a little bit, and especially to go back to a comment I made earlier. When I started with the bank, I was 17. I was underwriting credit by the time I was 21. I was the youngest person on the floor. One of the reasons I got the job, and this is really good for you guys too, is because I was part-time. So I was working 3 days a week and going to university, and so I had the flexibility. And I remember people just being astonished by my age. And then I started with EDC, and I'm going into companies where, again, these are old boys oil companies, and I'm walking in there, and I'm going to help them, and they're looking at me, and I mean, I've worked with EDC for 7, almost 8 years now. So I was in my mid-20s when I started, and people are looking at me going, "You're going to help me? Like, I have a daughter your age. Like, how do you have any credibility?" And so that can be really, and so there was a lot of that kind of like, why, that imposter kind of feeling, because you think, okay, I don't know how to approach this, and I don't, and how do I lead this conversation, yet not become an imposter. So it was really, really interesting. And, for anyone in those situations where, your age might be looked at as a detriment, I wouldn't concentrate on it too much. There's physical things that I do to elevate my age, and that's wear suits and, how I present myself. But, just be confident in who you are. Again, have the confidence to ask the questions, and, don't worry so much about who's on the other side of the table, because if you're competent at what you do and you can prove that out quickly, it won't matter. So I probably spent a little bit too much time concentrating on the imposter versus not, and how young I was, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Once your actions and your results show, I think that typically does it. But
exactly.
It takes a while to
it's
get
that first, it's that first initial engagement. And now it's funny because my colleagues, a lot of them are younger than me, and no one calls me kiddo anymore, and I'm kind of going, oh, okay, I guess I'm the old one now, so it's different. Older.
Yeah. So when EDC hires, what are they typically looking for, and do they look for people that are coming out of an undergraduate business program? So what types of things are they looking for?
It really depends. So at EDC, we have a very diverse background. So in Edmonton, we have 2 account managers, myself and another account manager, and then we have a district manager who deals with a few of the different provinces. But within EDC, I mean, we look at credit insurance, insuring receivables. We look at finance at multiple different levels. We guarantee bank finance. We have to keep a tap on the world, the banks in the world. We have to keep a tap on the economics of the world. We have to keep a tap on the politics of the world. So, within, and then we run the business, so tech and all that sort of thing, engineers. Now, most of that is headed out of Ottawa. But my point is that, if you're looking to work for EDC, there's a lot of things that you can do. I was over at an event, and there was some political science students there, and they were asking kind of the same question. I said, well, if you're willing to move to Ottawa and work for EDC, I mean, we have a host of political analysts that look at the world, which I think would be a really exciting job. If you're looking at account management or what we call financial sales, banking background, some sort of finance technical background, so even an undergrad and maybe some sort of finance designation, or an MBA, something like that. You just got to be able to look at, financial statements and package financing deals. But the other thing is, and we flip back and forth between kind of the banker mentality, but also the people mentality.
The relationship, and the soft skills.
Exactly, and the ability to go out and and talk to someone and put yourself in that situation to pick up the phone and have the skills to just be able to carry on a conversation. It's funny you mention this because when I'll never forget this, when I had my interview with EDC, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I had a friend, I was doing my MBA, I was knee deep in that, I was very busy, and I had a friend say to me, I found this job, it sounds exactly like what you want to do, you need to apply. And I was like, I just don't have time right now, like I've got a month left of my MBA. And something happened in the next few days where I decided to apply. So I show up at this building, not really sure what I'm doing. These two women walk in, they're like, okay, we're going to interview you. And one leaves, says, oh, do you want some water? And leaves. And the other one sits there and looks at me. And again, I had no idea who these people were, didn't pick up on anything. And, so I started talking to her. I said, hey, are you in Edmonton? Are you from Calgary? And she said, oh, I'm from Calgary. And so we had this conversation. And it turns out we used to live in the same area. But what I didn't know was that was part of the interview.
Okay.
And so, she left on purpose, and, the other lady sat there. And as someone who's in sales and has to go out and talk to people, they were looking for that skill. So I met all the check boxes, but they wanted to see whether or not I had, I had that skill. So for any of you out there, as soon as you walk across that door, the interview starts. Right, and so make sure that anything that you're doing represents who you are and what you want to be portrayed as. And I found out afterwards that a lot of people kind of failed that test.
They just
they
sit there and they wait until
So
very good. One of the points that you made about being outgoing and knowing when to say, how to engage people. I think that's something that is so important. That our students, you could have all the hard skills in terms of finance and understand, how to calculate balance sheet ratios and all of that. But if you can't really engage your customer, the person that's looking at it, and ask those hard questions in a way that is effective, that's not going to be you're not going to be very successful in today's world.
Yeah, exactly, and I have a lot of opinions on that. I mean, the way I look at business, and if you're going to work for an employer as opposed to for yourself, every employer is looking for a return on investment from their employees. And for me personally, I always like to stay close to the front line in the sense that I want to be driving the business, because from a security standpoint, for me, that's where it's at. So, if times get tough economically, and I'm in a back office somewhere calculating numbers, they're probably going to get rid of me before they get rid of the person who's actually out generating dollars.
Right.
So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah.
And it's not the same across everything, across every industry, but generally. So I think the idea of having an outgoing personality, even if you're an introvert, but just being able to know how to carry yourself. What to say. You're not going to do it perfectly all the time. And there's many times I go back to my office after a presentation or, after a call that particularly went bad, which is happening a little more than usual these days with our economy, and you kind of play that back in your head and you say, okay, next time, what would I say that would have a better impact? Or how could I, how would I react if that was said to me? And I use my own self as kind of that test, so.
Okay. Yeah, and one of our students asked a similar question in a similar vein, which is, how do you encourage yourself after maybe not doing as good or a failure, and how do you rebuild your motivation?
Well, I mean, I like to read a lot on, like Darren Hardy's Success Magazine and all that kind of stuff. And, and everyone keeps saying, and I try to put this in my own brain that, no failure is a failure unless you let it be a failure. And I think that's very cliche. And what I mean by that is, if you can take something that you've done wrong and you can make it better the next time, and learn from it and move forward, and if that failure requires you going to someone and saying, looking them in the face and saying, hey, you know what, I made a mistake, or I wasn't aware of this and I've learned this from it, then it's not such a failure like we consider a failure. I also believe that if you're not failing, if you're not doing anything, that you kind of do a gut check once in a while and say, oh, that could have been done a little bit better, or next time I'm going to do this. You're not taking as much risk as you need to in your life, and you're not moving forward. So, if I really screw up on something and I learn for the next time that I'm not going to screw up on that again, I've moved the benchmark forward because I know now that, I know that fact. And
you're not being too safe and you're not too conservative. And
I'm growing. So, if I look at where I was when I started as an account manager with EDC, I mean, to be quite honest with you, when I walked into the interview, I really had no idea what they even did, to be honest, like what, and I learned it, and, I had to go through all of those things, and I had to make mistakes, and I had to call clients and say, I told you it would be this, but it's actually going to be this because I screwed up. But I wouldn't make that mistake again, and so things move a little bit more freely later, and it'll still happen, right? It'll still not be perfect, and that's okay, and it allows you to move forward. So I think as long as you can take that gut check and use it to move forward, then you shouldn't necessarily think, oh my gosh, this is a failure. And that's not to say that you have to just pick up and move on. Take the time to kind of process it, mourn it, whatever you have to do, and then, pick yourself up and move to the next step.
So have you had any, some of our students might want to start their own businesses and do things internationally. I think now with the technology that's out there, it's easier to start up a business that has international sales or presence. What kind of advice would you give some of our students on, if they wanted to start up a business, how to go about it, given your kind of financing background, and what are some of the things you would advise them to do and some things to avoid?
So the first thing, and this is probably one of the reasons that I'm not an entrepreneur, is find something that you are passionate about. So find something that you want to marry yourself to, basically. There's a lot of grit and a lot of risk in international business, but the rewards are there. And in times like this, the companies that I'm seeing that are successful are the ones that have Canadian business and have international business, but they didn't get there overnight. So, in order to stick with it, you really have to believe in what you're doing, and this word comes up all the time, and it's a little bit cliche, but you really have to be passionate about it. You really have to believe in your product or service, and you really have to want to make it successful, because, the first time you go to do a contract and it doesn't work, you're going to have to pick yourself up and move on. Right? And if it's not something you're clearly invested in, it probably won't work that way. The other thing that I would say, in Canada, we think that, we do business right and the world does it different. And I would argue that it's kind of the opposite. So, in Canada, we tend to sign a contract, do some work, make some money, and then go about establishing a relationship with our buyer, right? It's kind of this test mentality. And what I've experienced with companies over the last 8 years doing trade is that they take that mentality with them along the way. And really, 95% of the rest of the world is very relationship driven. So if you're going to take your product or service internationally, you have to believe in it, and you have to be willing to invest the time. And that time is finding out, doing the research, doing the work, hiring people if you have to find out where you are going to be successful. So you have this technology or this product or this service that you think is wonderful. Who else thinks it's wonderful? Just because you like a country doesn't mean that's where your product is going to be successful. So you want to make sure that you can do the research and really know that there's a need for your product, and really know what your competitive advantage is. When you're talking to large international companies, they all have procurement lists of thousands of people. What they want from companies is, how are you going to do it better? How are you going to make me more money? how are you going to do it more environmentally friendly than what I currently have? And so you have to be very sharp about those things. And then you have to be willing to go and put the time in to establish the relationships. So, you know, in Canada, we say, okay, we're going to test you out, we're going to sign a contract, and if it goes well, we'll sign more. When you go to a place like anywhere in Asia, India, China, you know, Latin America, you go, you meet, you have coffee, you discuss family, you know, you're probably having dinner at the CEO or the CFO's house before you're actually signing a contract. And it may be a year after your first meeting, you know, and you may have invested some money into actually that relationship. So those are the things that are required. And a lot of times what the difference between a company who's successful and not is they don't put in the time, they just give up. Or, you know, they don't look at it as a relationship instead of a sale.
I know that when I was working out of Edmonton and we were doing some commodity business in Asia, and particularly in Taiwan, we were trying to get a customer, and it took years of visiting, and we would never get any deals, but they always said to us, we really value you coming to see us. And, you know, because they saw that there was a commitment on that behalf. And finally, I think we after about 4 or 5 years, we were actually able to get that. So the time frame of different cultures are remarkably different from what we expect. And here it's a very much, you know, we need to do the business, we need to sign a contract, we need to get on with life. But in there, it's, we need to understand that there's life and then there's business.
And a lot of times they intertwine. And to your point about the 4 and 5 years, you know, another thing that I've experienced is that in Canada, you know, a lot of times we're very much price driven. And I had a customer say to me once, you know, he was a rig manufacturer. And he says, you know what, in Canada, we're sophisticated enough here that a company can decide they want to buy a rig and they'll go out and buy all the components and they'll nickel and dime every supplier along the way. And so you'll have very skinny margins. He says, you know, we can go to Latin America, or we can go to Asia. They want a turnkey product that is going to have, you know, 10 times the margins that we would ever get in Canada. So yes, we had to put 2 years in. Yes, we had to go back and forth. Yes, we had to like rigorously negotiate a contract. But now we're building a rig for them, and we're going to make, you know, 45% margin as opposed to 10% in Canada. Right? So it was all worth it. And they're going to give us the next rig contract, and they're going to sign on the dotted line, and we're just going to go with it because we've established the relationship and they're not as concerned about price. I mean, you can't gouge the heck out of them, but they're probably not going to, you know, gouge you over a 5% margin. Whereas, you know, when it's specifically transactional, that's where you get really into those discussions.
Have you seen a difference in the type of businesses that are going international? I know, you know, we talk about, we have the oil service firms and oil, you know, oil-related things, but have we seen that there are other industries that potentially are more active internationally from Alberta and from Canada?
Yeah, I think that we have seen a huge shift, and there's been a huge shift in what the world needs as well. And as Canadians, you know, if our country is going to stay relevant and economically viable, you know, we have to look at exporting other things other than commodities, specifically oil. So, you know, we've seen a huge increase in clean tech type stuff, and that's a very broad kind of spectrum, but, you know, anything to do with environmental sustainability. You know, and different countries have different levels of where they want to be environmentally, and so, you know, that can be exported. You know, our demand here may only be this, but the demand somewhere else may be a lot better. You know, we've seen a huge increase in agri-food exports. So places like India and China, their middle class is growing faster than the whole Canadian population. It's exponential, and as middle classes grow, they want higher quality food, they want higher quality meats, they want processed food, right? So they think of processed food as
something that's
and so we have all that here, and we have the ability to get it over there, and so we're seeing a lot more of that stuff. And you know, when we have companies come to us and say, you know, we want to do more, we say, okay, well, this is where the opportunities are. U.S. is still our hugest trading partner, and so we send all sorts of goods down there. But you know, when you look at the developing world, it's changing, and we're able to put some of that.
So Canada is probably what, 75% of our exports go to the U.S.?
Yeah, it kind of fluctuates between 70 and 80.
70 and 80,
So, but interestingly enough, and this is an old statistic, probably from about 3 years ago, but Canada is only 2% of the world economy. So if you're doing business strictly in Canada as an entrepreneur, you're leaving 70 or 98%, of your potential growth on the table. And so that's something that usually strikes people.
Yeah, and a larger proportion of our GDP is international than a lot of other
Yeah,
countries.
again, that fluctuates too. It's usually about 80%.
Yeah.
And that's the whole idea behind a company like Export Development Canada. They say, okay, Canadian companies have barriers to exporting, and we need to help remove those barriers because trade is so important. 80% of Canada's bottom line is from trade, and if that starts to go away, we all have issues, right? I mean, it's not just companies, but it's just our country as a whole. Yeah.
Our whole standard of living.
Yeah, exactly.
One final question from a student, and it talks about all your years of education, and you did an MBA quite early. Was it worthwhile?
Yeah, I think so. And funny story, because we're here. The reason I did my MBA wasn't necessarily for my job at the time. I actually did an MBA because I wanted to teach. And so I actually teach here at MacEwan one class a semester. And the reason for that is because when I was going to MacEwan and then to U of L, I found it so fascinating to have professors that worked in the field and would come to you at like a sessional class and say, guess what I did today? I had an international law professor in Lethbridge that, he would come and tell us stories about his day and real life things. And I always wanted to bring that to students because I'm very passionate about post-secondary education. And so when I did my MBA, at the time, it was tough. And had someone told me what I was in for, working full-time, and I didn't have kids at the time, thankfully, but working full-time and going to school full-time, if someone told me, what it was actually going to take, I most likely would have backed away. Yeah. And really what got me through it was the fact that, you go from one class to the other and you invest more money and more time, and then you think, oh, man, I've invested all this money, I can't quit now. So yeah, when it was all said and done, I was exhausted, and it was very tough. But 6 years later, looking at the job that I have and the opportunities it's opened up for me to teach, it was definitely worthwhile. And I don't think that, I really strongly believe that there's at no point in your life should you give up on education. It doesn't have to be, like I say, I've been looking at the CPA, I've been taking some courses. It's probably going to be a little bit tough for me now. I have to be realistic about that with 2 small kids and teaching and a full-time job. But I'm always looking at, hey, how can I make myself better? I can make myself better by getting different experiences, but by learning things. And the thing about education is no one can take it away from you. It's not something that's negotiable. Some of the skills I have, we could probably negotiate whether I'm really good at them, right? But as soon as I have a designation or a degree or a post-degree, no one can take that away. And someone could say, I don't like you as an employee, let's say, and that's fine, but with your education and your background, you're not stuck then, right?
Yeah,
you can go somewhere else. Great. Had I been that girl that had stayed with the bank and relied on the bank and had no education to further my career, they would have always had a little bit of a hold on me, right? And so that's how I look at my education. I have no regrets. And I look forward to doing other education. I'm always looking for different things. And so now in my life, I look for just more coursework, right? So the CPA is probably a little bit too big for me now, but it doesn't mean I can't take finance courses. So I'm taking some courses through the Risk Management Association. I'm looking at a really cool leadership course they have at the U of A right now of doing that. So it's a little bit more incremental, but those are things once I'm done, no matter what happens in my life, they'll never be taken away.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks for all of your comments and the ideas that you've provided to our students about international and your own experience. So again, I'd like to thank Stacey for coming out to NextUp.
Okay.